My name is Shailene Woodley, and I am 34 years old. I want to start there because for most of my life, saying my own name out loud felt like an interruption, like I was breaking into a conversation nobody invited me into, like my existence was a polite inconvenience that everyone had agreed, without ever saying so directly, to tolerate as quietly as possible. I want to tell you about my brother Caleb, and about my mother Diane, and about the 10 years I spent bending myself into shapes that nobody asked for, shrinking into doorways, lowering my voice, swallowing my anger, folding my hurt into something small enough to slide under the rug before anyone noticed it was there. I want to tell you about the morning I finally stopped explaining myself, not dramatically, not with a speech, not with a door slam or a final devastating letter. I just stopped. I woke up one Tuesday in March, 3 years ago, and I looked at my phone and there was another message from my mother telling me that Caleb didn't mean it, and that I was being too sensitive and that family is family, and I put my phone face down on the nightstand, and I didn't pick it back up until after lunch. And then, when I did, I didn't respond to her. That was it, that was the whole revolution. But I need to go back, because that Tuesday morning didn't appear from nowhere. It was the accumulation of 31 years of accumulated evidence, 31 years of being handed a version of reality that didn't match what I could see with my own 2 eyes, 31 years of being told that my feelings were the problem when it was never my feelings that were the problem. The problem was never me. I just needed long enough to understand that. Before we get into this, I want to say something to anyone reading who has ever been the quiet one in their family, the one who holds things together, the one who apologizes first even when you did nothing wrong, the one whose hurt is always described as an overreaction while someone else's hurt is treated like a national emergency. I see you. This story is yours as much as it is mine. My mother had Caleb 11 months after she had me. 11 months. I mention this not to make you feel sorry for me, but because it is a fact that shaped everything. My mother was 23 years old, exhausted and underprepared and newly married to a man who meant well but worked constantly, and she had one infant who had just learned to sit up and another one growing inside her, and something in her, I think, made a calculation, not a conscious one, not a deliberate one, but a calculation nonetheless. She divided her attention, and she gave the larger share to the one she was more worried about. And Caleb, from his first breath, was more worrying. He was colicky and loud and demanding in ways that I apparently was not. I was told my whole childhood what an easy baby I was. I slept through the night early. I didn't fuss. I sat contentedly in my bouncy chair while my mother paced the kitchen at 2 in the morning with a screaming Caleb who wouldn't be soothed. I was easy. I have spent the better part of 3 decades understanding that being easy was not actually a compliment. Being easy meant being manageable. Being easy meant not requiring attention. Being easy meant that attention went elsewhere and everyone felt good about it because look, Shailene is fine. Shailene doesn't need anything. Let's focus on Caleb. Caleb needed things his entire life. That part was real. I don't want to reduce him to a villain because he isn't one, not entirely, and because reducing him makes the story simpler than it actually was, and simple stories are comfortable but they're not honest. Caleb had what I now understand was undiagnosed ADHD for the first 12 years of his life, and then a diagnosis that my parents sort of acknowledged and mostly ignored, and then a genuinely difficult adolescence full of impulsivity and poor decisions, and a talent for turning every room into a crisis. He was funny, charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into a party of strangers and leave with 3 new best friends, and a story everyone would repeat for years. He was also the kind of person who borrowed money and forgot to pay it back, who made promises he didn't keep, who hurt people with a sort of absent-minded consistency that he never seemed to fully register. And my mother loved him the way some mothers love the difficult child, desperately, protectively, with a ferocity that had no room in it for anyone else. I was 7 years old the first time I understood this explicitly. We were at my aunt's house for Thanksgiving, and I had drawn a picture. I was obsessed with drawing that year, filling notebook after notebook with elaborate imaginary landscapes and animals, and I brought it to show my mother, and she glanced at it and said, "Very nice, honey," without looking up from her conversation. 2 minutes later, Caleb knocked his juice glass off the table, and she was on her feet immediately, grabbing napkins, asking if he was okay, rubbing his back while he laughed at the mess he'd made. And I stood there holding my drawing, and I understood in the way that 7-year-olds understand things, completely and wordlessly, that this was just how things were. I put the drawing in my coat pocket. I don't know why I kept it, I just did. By the time I was 10, I had developed a kind of internal accounting system. I tracked what was noticed and what wasn't. I tracked which of my achievements generated dinner table conversation and which ones were received with the same, very nice honey that my drawings got. I won a spelling bee at school when I was in 4th grade, my name in the school newsletter, a small plastic trophy. My mother put the trophy on the shelf in the living room and forgot about it within a week. When Caleb joined the soccer team the following month and scored a goal in his first game, my father drove us all out to the field to watch, and afterward we went to friendlies and everyone ordered sundaes and my father called my uncle from the restaurant to tell him. I ate my sundae and smiled and said it was great, because it was great for Caleb, and Caleb was happy, and when Caleb was happy, the house was peaceful, and peaceful was something I had learned to value above almost everything else. I tell you this not to catalogue grievances. I tell you this because you need to understand who I was before Caleb started doing the things that would eventually break something in our family that I'm not sure can be fully repaired. I was the child who learned early that love in my house was not distributed equally, and who adapted to that fact by making myself small enough not to need very much of it. I was the child who learned to celebrate her own achievements privately, internally, with a quiet satisfaction that didn't require an audience. I was the child who absorbed every lesson about keeping the peace and applied it so thoroughly that by the time I was a teenager, I had essentially become invisible. And you know what happens to invisible people? They become useful. Invisible people are very good at noticing what other people need because they've spent their whole lives watching from the edges. I knew when my mother's headache was coming before she did. I knew when my father was stressed about work because he'd get quieter at dinner. I knew when Caleb was about to explode because there would be a particular stillness in him right before, a kind of held breath. And I managed all of this information. I deployed it. I made adjustments and accommodations and preemptive concessions, and nobody thanked me for it because nobody knew I was doing it, and I didn't know how to stop. I graduated from high school with a 4.1 GPA and a full scholarship to a state university 4 hours away. My parents came to graduation. My mother cried a little and hugged me. My father shook my hand and said he was proud of me. Caleb, who was 17 and had just failed 2 classes and was attending summer school, spent most of the graduation party on his phone. Nobody mentioned the scholarship at the party, or afterward. My grandmother gave me a card with $50 in it and said you were always the smart one, in a tone that somehow made it sound like an accusation, like being smart was a way of showing off. I drove myself to college 4 hours away with my things packed into my grandmother's old sedan, and when I got to my dorm room and sat on the bare mattress and looked out at the parking lot while my roommate's parents assembled her furniture with cordless drills, I felt something I didn't have a word for yet. It was relief and grief at the same time. Relief that I was somewhere new, somewhere nobody had already decided who I was. Grief because the decision to not make a big deal of my leaving hadn't been mine. College was the first place I understood what it felt like to take up space. My roommate was a girl named Priya Mehta who was studying pre-law and who had strong opinions about everything from campus food to constitutional interpretation, and she was the first person in my life who seemed genuinely interested in what I thought. Not in a pressuring way, not in the way of someone who needs a sounding board, she actually listened. She would ask me something and then sit quietly while I answered, and then she would respond to what I'd actually said, and it felt so foreign to me that the first few times it happened, I didn't know what to do with it. I started talking more, slowly and then all at once like something coming loose. I joined the campus literary magazine in my 2nd semester and found that I could really write, in a way that made people feel things. My editor, a senior named Marcus Webb who went on to publish 3 novels I've since read twice each, told me after reading my first submission that I had a voice that didn't apologize for itself, and that the best writing always comes from a place of hard-won clarity. I didn't tell him that I was still learning to stop apologizing for myself in real life. I just took the compliment and let it sit in my chest like something warm. I went home for Thanksgiving that first year and felt the shift immediately. Not in the house was exactly the same, but in me, I was different and the house didn't know what to do with a different version of me, so it tried to put me back into the version it recognized. Caleb was 18 by then, still in high school, still failing classes on and off, still the axis around which our household rotated. He'd gotten into some kind of trouble with a group of older kids, nothing serious, my parents said when I asked, but there was a tension in the house that everyone was carefully not talking about. At dinner the second night, I made the mistake of asking about it directly. I said, "So what actually happened with Caleb and those guys from the park?" My mother looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, a mixture of warning and mild offense, as though I had been rude. "Your brother has had a hard year," she said. "We're not going to relitigate it at the dinner table." "I wasn't trying to relitigate anything," I said. "I was just asking what happened." "Shailene," my father gently, the tone that meant let it go. I let it go. I ate my turkey. I helped clean up. The next morning, Caleb asked to borrow my car to go see a friend, and before I could say anything, my mother had already told him yes, it was fine, Shailene wouldn't mind. I minded a little. I had planned to drive out to see an old school friend that afternoon, but I said nothing, because saying something would have required an energy I didn't know yet how to sustain in that house, against those people, where the rules of engagement were set in stone, and I had no standing to change them. I drove back to campus on Sunday with my grandmother's sedan and parked it and sat in it for a while in the campus lot, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. And I thought, 4 more years of breaks and holidays, 4 more years of going back, 4 more years of Caleb being the center of everything and me learning to eat around the edges. But I also thought, I have something now that I didn't have before. I have a place where I exist fully. I have Priya who asks me what I think. I have Marcus who reads my words and finds them worth something. I have a room that is mine. I have a version of myself that isn't defined by the family I came from. Hold on to that, I told myself. Whatever happens, hold on to that. I held on to it. It wasn't always easy, but I held on to it. Caleb's worst years, in terms of the impact on me personally, were my late 20s. I need to explain what happened in between. I graduated from university with a degree in English literature and, impractically but joyfully, a minor in creative writing. I spent a year in a city 4 hours from home working for a non-profit that published a literary magazine. I moved in with Priya, who had deferred law school for a year and was working at a firm as a paralegal. We had an apartment with mismatched furniture and a cat named Footnote who knocked things off shelves with a purposefulness that seemed almost editorial. I got a job at a publishing house at 24, starting as an editorial assistant, the bottom of the ladder, reading slush piles and writing rejection letters, and occasionally, thrillingly, being asked to read something with real potential. I was good at it. I was very good at it. I had spent my whole life paying close attention to people who weren't paying attention to me, and it turned out that skill translated extraordinarily well into reading manuscripts. I could feel what was missing in a story. I could tell when a character was lying. I could hear the false notes in dialogue. My boss, a veteran editor named Carol Huang, who had been in publishing for 25 years and had a gift for identifying exactly what a book needed to become its best self, told me in my second year that I had editorial instincts she hadn't seen in someone so junior in a long time. I was promoted twice in 4 years. I had a caseload of my own by 27. I had authors I'd championed, books I'd helped shape, a professional identity that felt like it had been built by my own hands out of materials I'd gathered myself. My family was proud of me, I think, but proud in an abstract way, the way you're proud of the weather for being nice on a day you'd planned a picnic. My father mentioned my job at family gatherings sometimes when someone asked. Shailene works in publishing, she edits books, and people would nod and move on. My mother occasionally asked how work was, but in the tone of someone asking because it was polite, not because she was genuinely curious. She was more interested in Caleb's work situation, which was constantly shifting, constantly in some state of crisis or recovery that required her attention and energy and worry. Caleb at 25 was working sporadically. He'd had 5 jobs in 3 years. He was good at getting them and bad at keeping them. The impulsivity, the conflicts with supervisors, the inability to show up consistently when his mood was bad. I don't say this without compassion. I know now, with the perspective of years and a lot of reading and a therapist named Dr. Ananya who has changed my life, that Caleb was struggling with things that were real and difficult. But at the time, all I experienced was the wake he left behind. The worried phone calls from my mother, the money my parents lent him and never asked to be repaid, the way every family gathering eventually became, somehow, about Caleb's latest situation. And I accommodated it. I always accommodated it. I showed up, I listened, I offered quiet encouragement when it seemed wanted, and I said nothing about what I was watching because what I was watching was a pattern, and namming patterns in my family was treated as aggression. Here is the specific thing that broke the first seal, the first crack in my willingness to keep being the easy one. I was 28, it was Christmas. I had come home for a week. I didn't do that very often anymore, the week-long visits, because they were exhausting in a way I couldn't fully explain to people who didn't understand this particular dynamic. But it was Christmas, and my grandmother was 81 and I wanted to see her, and so I came. Caleb was there. He was living at home again, temporarily as he put it, while he figured things out. He'd been there for 8 months. He had a girlfriend, Tara, who was sweet and slightly bewildered by our family in the same way I was, and she came over for Christmas dinner and sat next to me, and we had a very pleasant conversation about books, which she liked, and I liked her for that. The incident happened on Christmas morning. I had gotten up early, the way I always do, and I'd made coffee and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book when Caleb came down around 9:30. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, and we talked a little, comfortable, easy, because one-on-one, Caleb and I could sometimes find the sibling frequency that bypassed all the family static. We talked about Tara, about his current job search, about a podcast we'd both apparently been listening to. It was nice. And then I mentioned, because it had been on my mind and because it seemed like the right moment, that I'd heard about a program through a non-profit that helped people with ADHD develop workplace skills, structured mentorship, real practical tools. I'd looked it up. I had the name of the organization and the contact information in my phone. I offered to text it to him. He went still. Not angry, not exactly, just still. In that particular way of his, the held breath way I knew from childhood. I don't need a program, he said. I know, I said, I just thought it might be useful. You think I need fixing? I think you've been struggling, and there are resources. I don't need resources, Shailene. His voice was still level, but I could hear the edge under it. I need people to stop acting like I'm broken. I don't think you're broken, I said. I think you've been having a hard time and I thought. He put his coffee mug down on the counter and walked out of the kitchen. I heard him go upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at my book and felt the familiar closing in feeling, the sense of having done something wrong by trying to do something right. My mother came downstairs 15 minutes later. Caleb had apparently already told her what had happened in his version. She stood at the counter pouring coffee and said without looking at me, "You know he's sensitive about that stuff." "I know," I said. "You have to be careful with how you approach him." I looked at her. "Mom, I was trying to be helpful." "I understand that, but you know how he takes things." There it was, "You know how he takes things." A sentence that translated meant, the responsibility for his reaction is yours. The responsibility for managing his feelings is yours. Your intentions don't matter. What matters is his response, and his response is your fault. I said, "So I shouldn't try to help him." "I'm just saying be mindful of his feelings." "What about my feelings?" I said, and I heard how it sounded, slightly wounded and slightly childish, and I hated that I sounded that way, but I also was slightly wounded and there wasn't a more dignified way to say it. I was trying to do something kind. He got upset and left the room, and now I'm being told I did something wrong. My mother finally looked at me. "You're both my children," she said. "I just want everyone to have a nice Christmas." And there was the other sentence, "You're both my children." A sentence that was technically true and practically meaningless because it implied equity that did not exist. I was both her children, technically. But the management of the holiday, the management of everyone's feelings, the management of the peace, that was mine. The entitlement to react, to leave rooms, to be approached carefully, that was his. I got up and rinsed my coffee mug and said, "Merry Christmas, Mom," and went upstairs to get ready for the day. Later, exchanging gifts, Caleb acted as though nothing had happened. He was charming and funny, and he gave me a book he'd remembered I'd mentioned wanting, and I thanked him genuinely because it was a thoughtful gift, and because that was true of him too. He could be thoughtful. He could be warm. He could be the brother I loved in glimpses and intervals. But I sat there opening my book with its bookmark already tucked inside, and I thought, this is the pattern. Something happens. He reacts. I'm the problem. He moves on, and I'm left holding the weight of it while he's already somewhere else entirely. I drove back to my apartment after Christmas. Footnote was at Priya's. She'd been watching him while I was gone, and I went to pick him up and I ended up staying for dinner, and at some point I started talking about Christmas and I didn't stop for 45 minutes. Priya let me talk. She asked clarifying questions at the right moments. At the end, she said, "Can I say something that might be hard to hear?" "Yes," I said. "The problem isn't Caleb," she said. "I mean, Caleb is a problem, but the structural problem is your mom, because your mom is the one who keeps telling you to manage yourself around him instead of expecting him to manage himself. And as long as she keeps doing that, nothing changes because he has no reason to change." I thought about that for a long time. It wasn't news exactly. It was a thing I'd known somewhere in the part of me that tracks patterns, but having Priya say it plainly without drama just as a fact, it settled into me differently. The problem isn't just Caleb, the problem is the system, and the system requires my participation to function. The next 3 years were a slow education in what it meant to try to change the system from inside it. I started setting limits, small ones carefully chosen because I was still learning what I was actually permitted to have. I stopped lending Caleb money when he asked, which he did 2 or 3 times a year. The first time I said no, he was confused. The second time he was hurt. The third time he asked my parents instead, and my mother called me later that week and said, gently but with weight, that Caleb was struggling and family helps family. I said, "I know, Mom. I've loaned him money 4 times in 3 years and he hasn't paid any of it back, and I'm not going to keep doing it." She said she understood. She didn't really understand, but she didn't push further that time. I started leaving family gatherings when things got uncomfortable, instead of staying and absorbing the discomfort. This was harder than the money thing because leaving required more visible action. Staying was passive, leaving was a statement. The first time I did it, Caleb had made a comment about my apartment being in a weird neighborhood that was really a comment about me making choices he didn't understand, and it escalated into a tense exchange that my mother immediately tried to smooth over by talking to me instead of him. I quietly excused myself, got my coat, kissed my grandmother goodbye, and said I was tired and heading home. My mother followed me to the door with her particular expression of controlled alarm. "You're leaving already? I'm tired, Mom, but we haven't even had dessert. I'll have dessert next time." I kissed her cheek and left. In the car, my hands shook for a few blocks, then they stopped, and I felt underneath the adrenaline something that took me a while to identify: pride. Not the performance of pride, not the public kind, the private kind, the kind you feel when you do something hard that is genuinely yours to do. I started going to therapy that year. I want to be clear about what therapy did for me, because I think people sometimes imagine it as the moment everything gets fixed, and that's not what it is. What Dr. Ananya did, over the first year and then the years that followed, was give me a language for what I'd been experiencing. She gave me frameworks. She gave me something to say to myself when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. She helped me understand that the accommodations I'd spent my life making had kept the peace at a cost I was paying alone, and that the cost was my own sense of reality, my own sense of what was reasonable, my own sense of what I deserved. "You've been the designated space holder," she said once, in a session I still think about. "The person in the family who holds all the space for everyone else's feelings, so they don't have to hold their own. That's an enormous job, and you've been doing it since you were a small child. And the thing about space holders is that they're incredibly useful, so the system works very hard to keep them in that role." "How do you stop?" I asked. "You stop holding the space," she said, "and you let everyone else's feelings land where they land." It sounds simple. It is the opposite of simple, because letting other people's feelings land where they land means watching people feel things and not rushing in to smooth it over or apologize or reframe it or make yourself smaller so there's more room for them. It means being willing to be seen as difficult. It means accepting that your limits will sometimes make other people uncomfortable and that their discomfort is not your emergency. My mother's discomfort was, in the language of my nervous system, an emergency. It had been an emergency my whole life. Learning to let it land, to watch her be uncomfortable and not rush to undo the thing that had made her uncomfortable, was one of the hardest things I have ever done. It was harder than the job. It was harder than the years of professional insecurity, the imposter syndrome, the learning curve of a demanding industry. None of that compared to the work of learning to stop managing my mother's feelings. I was 31 when things reached the point that I've been building toward, the incident that I now think of as the one that finally clarified what had been murky for decades. It started with an apartment. Caleb was 30 years old. He'd been living at home off and on for most of the past few years, with occasional stretches in shared houses with friends that usually ended in some kind of falling out. He and Tara had broken up, mutual apparently, though I always wondered, and he was single and restless, and my parents, visibly agging now in ways that I noticed when I visited, were carrying the weight of his instability in their bodies. My mother's shoulders had a permanent set to them, a tension that didn't release. My father looked tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with sleep. I had been thinking for a while, carefully, practically, about the idea of helping Caleb get his own apartment, not giving him money because we'd established that didn't work, but helping him set up a plan. I had by this point a solid savings account, the result of several years of careful choices and 2 promotions. I was not rich, but I was stable, which was more than either of my parents could say, because my father's business had had several rough years and my parents were managing, but only just. I sat down with Caleb, just the 2 of us, at a coffee shop near my parents' house. I had thought about this carefully beforehand. I had written out in my journal what I wanted to say and what I expected might happen and what I was and wasn't willing to offer. I wanted to have the conversation from a prepared place, not a reactive one. I told him I wanted to help him find a stable living situation. I told him I believed he was capable of more than his current circumstances suggested. I told him I was not offering to fund a lifestyle. I was offering to co-sign a lease for 12 months on the condition that he was employed, paying his portion consistently, and meeting with a financial advisor to set up a budget. I had researched this. I knew a financial advisor through a friend at work who did first-time budget consultations for a reduced fee. I had the information ready. Caleb listened. He was quiet throughout in that held-breath way, and I'd learned enough by now not to read stillness as agreement or disagreement, just processing. When I finished, he said, "Why do you always make it into a project?" "I'm not making it into a project," I said. "I'm offering practical help." "It feels like a project. Here's the plan, here are the conditions, here's the financial advisor." His voice had an edge to it, like you're my social worker. I took a breath. "I'm trying to help in a way that actually helps," I said, "because I care about you and I've watched you struggle and I want things to be better for you." "What if I don't want better on your terms?" "What are your terms?" He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at his coffee, and then he said something that stopped me cold. He said, "You've always thought you were better than me." I looked at him. I looked at my brother, who I loved in the complicated way you love someone who has been woven into the fabric of your life from before either of you had a choice, who I had protected instinctively, even when I was angry at him, who I had worried about in the middle of the night, who I had hoped for with a persistence that had not always been kind to me. "I don't think I'm better than you," I said. "I think I'm different from you. I think I've made different choices. I think we've been treated differently our whole lives, and I think you've needed more than I did, and I think the family has given you more than I've gotten, and I think you probably don't know that, and I'm not angry about it, not right now, but I need you to hear me when I say that offering you help is not the same as thinking I'm better than you. It means the opposite." There was a silence. Then he said, "I'll think about the apartment thing." He did think about it. He called me 2 weeks later and said he wanted to try it. We found a 1-bedroom in a decent neighborhood, reasonable rent, walkable to the area where he'd gotten a new job at a restaurant supply company. I co-signed the lease. I went with him to the financial advisor consultation, which was awkward and slightly tense, but which he sat through, and which produced a budget he seemed to take seriously, at least initially. For 6 months it worked. He paid his rent. He kept his job. We talked on the phone more than we had in years, real conversations, not the ones mediated by holidays and parental hovering. I thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that we could have been close, might have been close if the family architecture had been different. Then in the 7th month he lost the job. Not his fault, he said. The company had layoffs, I believed him mostly. He was 3 weeks behind on rent by the time he told me. He'd been handling it, he said. I asked how he'd been handling it, and he said he'd been handling it, and eventually it came out that he had not been handling it so much as hoping it would resolve itself if he gave it enough time. My name was on the lease. I was getting calls from the property management company. I covered 2 months of back rent from my savings. I was angry about it, but I did it, because I had signed my name and that meant something to me even when it was expensive. I told Caleb that I would cover the 2 months, that I needed him to job search immediately and consistently. and that I needed him to tell me what was happening rather than letting it accumulate. He agreed to all of this. He got a new job within 3 weeks. Things stabilized again. And then I made the mistake of telling my mother what had happened. I told her because she called me out of the blue one Sunday evening and asked how Caleb was doing, and something in me, the exhaustion maybe of having managed this alone for months, made me want to share it. I wasn't looking for my mother to fix anything. I wasn't even looking for sympathy exactly. I just wanted to tell someone in our family what it had actually been like. He got behind on rent, I said. I had to cover 2 months. My mother was quiet. I handled it, I said. I'm not asking for anything, I just wanted you to know. I didn't know things had gotten that bad, she said. He didn't tell me either, until I started getting calls from the property manager. He probably didn't want to worry you. I paused. He didn't want to tell me because he knew I'd be concerned and he'd have to deal with that. That's different from protecting me. Another silence. He's been through a lot, my mother said. And there it was. He's been through a lot. The sentence that in our family functioned as a blanket absolution, covering everything in soft wool until it was impossible to see the shape of it clearly. Mom, I said, and I tried to keep my voice even, tried to bring all of my therapy work to bear on this moment. I've been through a lot too. I've been managing this mostly alone, and I've spent my own money, and I'm not asking you to be angry at him. I'm just asking you to also acknowledge that I've been dealing with something real. I know you have, she said, but Caleb needs. What do I need? I asked. I'm just curious, what do you think I need right now? There was a pause that lasted long enough that I counted the seconds, 7 of them. I don't know, my mother finally said. What do you need? And I realized, sitting there with the phone against my ear, that she genuinely didn't know. Not because she didn't care. I believe she cared in the ambient way she cared about me, the way you care about something that is stable and manageable and doesn't require your active attention. But she didn't know because she'd never had to think about it. I had spent 30 years making sure she didn't have to think about it. I was so good at taking care of myself, so thoroughly trained in self-sufficiency, that the idea of me needing something visible enough to require her attention had never really registered as a possibility. I need you to acknowledge, I said slowly, that this was hard and that I handled it well and that it would have been nice to not have to handle it alone. You could have called me, she said. I'm calling you now. I mean when it was happening. I thought about whether to say the next thing. I decided to say it. When it was happening, I didn't call because I knew what would happen. I knew you'd tell me he was going through a lot and that he didn't mean it and that I needed to be patient. And I was too tired for that conversation. The silence this time was different, heavier. I'm sorry you feel that way, she said. And there it was again, the non-apology, the apology for my feelings rather than for the thing that caused them. I'm sorry you feel that way, not I'm sorry things were that way, not I'm sorry I've made it so difficult for you to come to me. Just I'm sorry you feel. Okay, I said, I'll let you go. Shailene. I'm fine, Mom, I'll talk to you later. I hung up, I sat on my couch. Footnote came and sat on my lap, heavy and warm, and I put my hand on his back and felt him purring, and I thought, I have been explaining myself to her for 31 years, and she's never once changed how she responds, not because she's cruel, not because she's malicious, but because explaining has never been the mechanism of change in my family. Explaining has just been how I perform my compliance with the system. I explain, she listens, she apologizes for my feelings, and everything continues as before. I thought about what Dr. Ananya had said about systems, about what it means to stop holding the space. And I thought, what would it look like if I stopped explaining? I didn't stop all at once. I want to be honest about that because I think the narrative of setting limits often gets told as a single decisive moment, a clean before and after, and that's not true, not for me. It was more like learning to walk after an injury, hesitant, and sometimes I fell back into old patterns, and sometimes I had to start over. There was the Thanksgiving when Caleb, now in a new apartment that he'd gotten on his own, I was proud of him for that genuinely, made a comment at dinner about my being uptight, because I'd suggested gently that we let Grandma finish her sentence before we all jumped in. My mother looked at me with that expression, the one that meant be careful, and I looked back at her and said evenly, I'm not uptight. I'd just like everyone to let Grandma finish talking. And Caleb rolled his eyes and my mother pivoted the conversation and nothing was addressed. But I had said the thing and I had not immediately walked it back or apologized for it, and that was something. There was the Christmas when Caleb borrowed my car to run a quick errand and came back 3 hours later with the fuel tank on empty and a vague story about where he'd been. I asked him to fill the tank. He said he'd get to it. I said, I need you to fill it before I leave tomorrow. He said he didn't have cash. I said, I'll Venmo you the amount, can you please take care of it tonight? He said, it's not a big deal, Shailene, it's just gas. I said, it's a big deal to me, please take care of it. He looked at me like I was speaking a language he hadn't expected to hear from me. My mother walked through the kitchen during this exchange, clocked the tension and looked at me, again me with that look. And I held my ground. I looked back at my mother steadily and said nothing. I looked back at Caleb and said, please. He filled the tank. He was sulky about it, but he did it. Small things, incremental things, but they added up. Then the incident that changed the equation permanently. I was 31 and it was March, a cold Tuesday in March, and Caleb had called me the night before. He was upset, a fight with a coworker that he felt had been handled unfairly, a situation where I genuinely did not know whether he was right or wrong and couldn't tell from his account because his accounts of conflicts always presented him as entirely innocent in a way that had started to make me wonder. We talked for 40 minutes. I listened. I asked questions. At the end he said, what do I do? And I said, I think you should request a meeting with your manager and lay out the facts as calmly as you can. He said, what if they're already against me? I said, then you deal with that when it happens, but assuming the worst before you try doesn't help you. He seemed to hear that. We said goodnight. The next morning I woke up to 2 texts from Caleb and 3 texts from my mother. Caleb's texts were, you're not on my side and forget it. My mother's texts were, Caleb called me this morning, he says you told him his feelings were wrong, and can you please call me? I put my phone face down on the nightstand. I lay there looking at the ceiling. The morning light was doing the thin grey thing it does in early March, flat and non-committal. I could hear the street outside, a garbage truck, some pigeons, someone's dog barking. I thought I spent 40 minutes listening to him. I did not tell him his feelings were wrong. I did not take the co-worker's side. I offered him a practical suggestion. He told me to forget it this morning, which means something happened between our call and this morning, some shift in his processing, and rather than come back to me with it, he went to our mother and described it in a way that this is the word I kept returning to, not accurate. I thought about calling Caleb, explaining what I'd actually said. I knew exactly how that call would go. I thought about calling my mother, explaining what had actually happened. I knew exactly how that call would go. I thought, I have had these calls before. I have had them dozens of times. I explain. She listens. She says, I'm sure you didn't mean to upset him. She says you know how sensitive he is. She says family is family. And I say okay, and the cycle completes, and 3 weeks later there's another version of this same call. I put my phone back down. I got up, I made coffee. I fed Footnote. I went to work. On the train I read a book. At work I had meetings and read a manuscript and wrote editorial notes, and had lunch with a colleague who was funny and smart and who talked about her weekend with an ease that I was still, at 31, still learning to inhabit in my own life. When I got home that evening I had 6 more texts from my mother and 2 missed calls, no more from Caleb. I sat down on my couch with Footnote and I read all the texts. They escalated from concerned to confused to something approaching hurt. The final text said, I'm worried about you both. Can we please talk? I put my phone down again. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the 40 minutes I'd spent listening to Caleb the night before. I thought about all the nights like that, all the 40-minute calls, all the dinners and holidays and conversations. I thought about the money I'd loaned that had never come back. I thought about the 2 months of back rent I'd paid with my own savings. I thought about the Christmas with the gas tank. I thought about the Thanksgiving where I was uptight. I thought about the spelling bee trophy that spent a week on the shelf before it migrated to a box in the basement. I thought about my drawing in my coat pocket. And I thought, I have been explaining myself since I was 7 years old. And nothing has changed. The explaining is not the mechanism of change. The explaining is how I participate in a system that requires my participation to function. What happens if I stop participating? I texted my mother back. 1 sentence, I'm okay, I just need some time to think. She responded immediately, how much time? I thought about that. It was a fair question in a way. It was also a kind of pressure, a way of putting a limit on the space I was trying to take. I didn't respond to that text. I didn't respond that night or the next day or the day after that. On the fourth day, my mother called again, and I let it go to voicemail and listened to the message. She was worried, she wanted to understand what had happened, she just wanted to talk. Her voice was strained in the way that told me she was frightened, and part of me, the part that had been managing her feelings since childhood, wanted to immediately call her back and smooth it over, and say it was fine, I was fine, we were all fine. I didn't call back. I called Dr. Ananya instead. We had a session that week that I think of now as a turning point, not because of any single thing she said, but because of the moment when she asked me, "What are you afraid will happen if you don't respond?" "She'll be upset," I said. "She already is upset," Dr. Ananya said. "She'll think I'm angry." "Are you angry?" "Yes," I said, and then surprised by myself. "Yes, I am. I've been angry for years and I've been acting like I'm not because being angry felt like being the bad one. And now I think being angry might be the most honest thing I've done." I did not cut my family off. I want to be clear about this because the story of women who set limits in difficult family situations often gets told in binary terms. You either endure everything or you cut everyone off, and both extremes are treated as equally radical, equally dramatic. What I did was neither of those things. What I did was remove my active participation from the pattern. I stopped explaining. I stopped defending my choices. I stopped managing my mother's worry. I stopped being available for Caleb's framing of every conflict in which I appeared as a character. I still answered my mother's calls when I felt able to. I just answered them differently. I said less. I let silences exist without rushing to fill them. I didn't offer context or explanations that she hadn't asked for. When she brought up Caleb, which she did often, I didn't engage with the subject beyond saying something neutral. "I hope things get easier for him," was a thing I said frequently in those months, and it was honest. I did hope things got easier for him. I just wasn't going to make myself the mechanism by which they became easier. Caleb didn't reach out for about 6 weeks after the Tuesday morning texts. When he did, it was a brief text asking if I'd seen a show he'd heard I was watching. I said yes. He said, "Was it good?" I said yes. He said cool. That was the entire exchange. Normal almost, skimming the surface of normalcy while the deep water stuff went unaddressed. My mother called one evening about 2 months in and asked directly what I wanted. I could tell it was a practiced question. She'd thought about it beforehand, maybe talked to my father, maybe even looked something up. It was a good question. It deserved a real answer. "I want to be in a family where my experience gets taken seriously," I said. "Not more seriously than anyone else's, just as seriously. When I tell you that something Caleb did was hurtful, I want to be heard, not told to be more understanding, not told about how hard things have been for him, heard. And then I want some expectation, even a small one, that the thing that hurt me won't just keep happening with no acknowledgement." My mother was quiet. "I don't think I'm asking for something unreasonable," I said. "I've never tried to make you feel like your feelings don't matter," she said. "I know," I said. "I know you haven't tried to, but it has been the effect. And after 31 years, the effect is what I'm dealing with." She cried a little then, not loudly, but I could hear it. And I felt the old pull, the urge to comfort, to take it back, to say, "I'm sorry, it's not that bad, I love you, it's fine." I felt it very clearly, like a physical thing, and I didn't act on it. I said, "I love you, Mom, I'm not going anywhere, I just need things to be different." She said she would try. I believed her, and I also knew that trying was not the same as changing, and that I would have to wait and see which one it was. The next 8 months were strange. Not dramatic, not the kind of estrangement you see dramatized in movies, with slamming doors and returned letters and years of total silence, more like a slow recalibration. I visited my parents for my grandmother's birthday in June. She turned 82, and she was smaller than I remembered, and I watched her across the table at the restaurant we went to for her birthday dinner, and felt an ache that had nothing to do with my brother or my mother, just the simple ache of watching someone you love get older. I sat next to her, and she told me about a book she was reading, and I told her about a manuscript I was editing, and we talked, really talked, for almost an hour, while the rest of the table handled its own conversations around us. Caleb was at the dinner. We were cordial. He told a funny story about a mistake at work that had somehow turned into a small local legend among his co-workers, and it was genuinely funny, and I laughed, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Relief, maybe, or the specific longing of someone who wants to believe things are okay without having addressed why they weren't. My mother watched us both with the focused attention of someone diffusing something. She had always done that at family gatherings, managed the energy of the room, preemptively smoothed whatever might roughen. I'd grown up watching her do it. I understood now what it must cost her. I also understood that it was, at least partly, her choice, that the thing she was managing was a dynamic she'd had a hand in creating, and that her constant management was part of why the dynamic persisted. You can't manage a system into health. At some point the system has to change, or you have to stop managing it, and both options are terrifying when the system is your family. I drove home from my grandmother's birthday dinner and called Priya, who now lived 2 time zones away and had a husband and a 6-month-old daughter and a legal practice she'd been building for 5 years. We talked for an hour, which we still do because some friendships are just built to hold more weight than others, and ours is one of them. I told her about the dinner. She asked the right questions. At the end she said, "You seem steadier." "I feel steadier," I said. "What changed?" I thought about it. "I stopped waiting to be understood," I said. "I think I spent years waiting for my mom to finally hear me the way I needed to be heard, and every time she didn't, it felt like a fresh rejection. But I stopped waiting. I just exist now in the family without waiting for the validation, and it's quieter." "Quieter good or quieter sad?" "Both," I said, "both." I was 32 when Caleb lost his apartment. Not because of job loss this time. Because of a situation with a roommate. He'd moved in with a friend after his lease ended, that had apparently escalated over several months through misunderstandings and unaddressed tensions into a situation where he was asked to leave. He had 30 days. He called me. I listened. He explained. He asked if he could stay with me for a few weeks while he figured out his next move. I thought about it carefully. I said, "I need to ask you some questions before I answer." He said, "Okay." I asked, "Do you have a job right now?" "Yes." "Are you actively looking for a new place?" He said he would be. I said, "That's not the same as yes, are you actively looking, meaning you have already started looking?" He said he hadn't, but he would start right away. I said, "Okay, I'm willing to have you stay for 3 weeks. I need you to be looking for a place every day, not eventually. I need to know my space. And if something isn't working, I need us to be able to talk about it without it becoming a whole thing." He said, "That's a lot of conditions." "It's a few basic things," I said, "and I'm doing something for you. I need to know we can make it work." There was a silence, then he said, "Okay, thank you." He stayed for 3 weeks, then 4, then 5. The place searching was inconsistent. I said something about it on day 28 calmly, reminding him of what we'd agreed. He said he was working on it. I said I needed to see it, not because I didn't trust him, but because we'd agreed to it and I needed to know we were on the same page. He found a place on day 35, a room in a house with 2 other guys, not ideal but functional within his budget. On the day he moved out, we stood in my living room with his duffel bag and his box of things, and I thought he might say something about the stay, about any of it. Instead he said, "Sorry if I was a pain." "You weren't a pain," I said. "You were dealing with something hard." "I know I'm a lot," he said, and it landed with a weight that told me he'd been thinking about this, or maybe thinking about what I'd said months ago about the family dynamics. Had any of it reached him? I didn't know. "You're not a lot," I said. You've always been used to having a lot of help without a lot of structure. I think structure is actually good for you. I think when there are clear expectations, you do better than you get credit for." He looked at me. "That's the nicest mean thing you've ever said to me." "It wasn't mean," I said. "I know," he said. "That was a joke." We stood there for a second, and then he picked up his box and I got the door, and I helped him carry things to the rideshare, and when it drove away I went back inside and sat on my couch and Footnote came and sat next to me and I thought, that's something. That conversation was something. Not everything, but something. The thing that changed my mother happened in a way I didn't engineer and wouldn't have predicted. It was October. I was 32. I had gone home to visit my parents for the weekend. My father had been having some health things, nothing alarming yet but the kind of things that make you want to show up, be present, sit at the kitchen table and be a daughter. My mother and I were in the kitchen on Saturday morning. She was making eggs. I was drinking coffee and reading. It was almost peaceful, the kitchen quiet except for the pan, the particular domestic calm of a Saturday morning in the house where you grew up. She said without preamble, without looking up from the stove, "I've been thinking about what you said, a long time ago, about not knowing what you need." I looked up from my book. "I think I didn't know," she said. "I think I convinced myself that because you were managing you were fine, and fine and good aren't the same thing, and I don't think I knew the difference for a long time." The eggs sizzled. She turned them with a spatula. "I'm not saying I handled everything right with your brother," she said. "I know I didn't. I know there were times I asked too much of you. I know I made you manage things that weren't yours to manage." I said nothing. I was afraid that if I said anything she would stop, and I wanted her to keep going. "I'm sorry for that," she said. She turned around and looked at me, and her face was the face of a woman in her mid-50s who had been carrying something a long time. "I'm sorry for making you feel like your needs were less important. They weren't. You were always so capable, so good at handling things, and I think I used that as a reason not to worry about you." "Mom, let me finish," she said. "I'm trying." She turned back to the stove. "I love your brother," she said, "but I love you too, and I think for a long time love looked different for the two of you. For him it looked like intervention, every time he needed something, and for you it looked like trust, like I trust you to be okay. But trust isn't the same as caring, I know that now, I should have known it sooner." The eggs were done. She turned off the heat. She stood with her back to me for another moment, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the same tension that had been there for years, but it looked different now, or maybe I was seeing it differently. Not the tension of management, but the tension of someone doing something hard that they believe is necessary. "Thank you," I said, "for saying that." She turned around and brought the pan to the table. She put eggs on both our plates. She sat down across from me, and we ate breakfast together in the kitchen, and neither of us said anything else for a while, and it was a different kind of quiet from all the other kinds. Not the peace that comes from avoidance, not the peace that comes from my small self knowing not to take up too much room, but something that felt, tentatively and imperfectly, like something earned. Caleb and I had the real conversation 3 months after that, in January, at a coffee shop not unlike the one where we talked about the apartment 2 years earlier. He'd asked to meet, no context, just "Can we get coffee?" I said yes. He was there before me, which wasn't usual. Caleb was chronically late to things, and I'd learned to arrive without expectations. He had 2 coffees already, one for me, and I looked at that small thing and felt it as a larger thing. He talked first. He told me that he'd been in therapy. He said it quickly and without a lot of emphasis, like he was ripping something off, getting past the difficult disclosure so he could move on. He'd been going for about 4 months. He'd started partly because his new girlfriend had suggested it, and partly because, he paused here, because of some things that had come up in conversations with my mother. He didn't say exactly what things. I didn't push. "I've been thinking about how I treated you," he said. "How I've treated you, past tense but also like present tense, because I don't think I fully stopped." I looked at my coffee. "I think I've known for a long time that things were unfair," he said. "I don't mean that you had it harder. I don't know all the ways you had it harder. I think I don't know because I wasn't looking. But I knew that Mom focused on me a lot. And I think part of me let that happen because it felt good to be the one she focused on, even if the reasons weren't great. And I didn't think about what that meant for you. Or I did sometimes, and I told myself it was fine because you were fine." "Because I was managing," I said. "Yeah," he said, "because you were managing." We sat with that. "The thing with the texts," he said, referring to the Tuesday in March, though we'd never directly spoken about it. "I know I framed that wrong to Mom. I know what you actually said. I knew it at the time. I was in a bad place and I wanted someone on my side, and I didn't think about what it cost you. I should have." "It cost me a lot," I said. "Not just that time, but that time was the one where I finally couldn't absorb it anymore." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry." An apology for the thing, not for my feelings about the thing. I sat with it. I felt it. I said, "I hear you." "Are we okay?" he asked. I thought about that question, what it contained and what it couldn't. "We're working on it," I said, "which is more than we were, and that's real." He nodded. He looked relieved and also slightly unsteady, the way people look when they've done something brave that didn't land with the force they hoped for. And I felt for him, I genuinely did, because this was hard for him and he was trying, and trying is not nothing. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes. All those years, I said, did you know that the money and the attention and the focus, did you know I wasn't getting any of it? He was quiet for a long moment. I knew I was getting a lot, he finally said. I don't think I did the math. I don't think I counted your side of it. I did, I said. I counted every time. He flinched a little. I know. I don't say that to make you feel terrible, I said. I say it because I want you to understand that it was real. It wasn't just me being sensitive. There was something real happening in that house, and you were a part of it, even if you didn't choose to be. I know, he said again, and then quieter, I'm sorry you spent so long counting. That sentence landed in me somewhere deep. I hadn't expected it. I hadn't expected him to see that particular thing, the accounting, the internal ledger I'd kept for decades. And hearing it acknowledged, not fixed, just acknowledged, was something I hadn't known I was still waiting for. I looked at my brother across the table. He was 31 years old and he looked the age of someone who had had a harder time than necessary and was slowly, imperfectly, finding some traction. He was my brother. He was difficult and warm and impulsive and funny, and someone I had loved and been hurt by in measures that couldn't be easily untangled from each other. Thank you for meeting me, he said. Thank you for asking, I said. I am 34 now. I want to tell you what things look like, because I think the ending that people expect is either a perfect reconciliation, everything repaired and gleaming, or a permanent estrangement, everything severed and clean. Neither of those is the truth. The truth is that my mother and I talk every 2 weeks or so, sometimes more. We talk about real things now, not just the surface things. She asks about my work with a specificity that tells me she's been paying attention, and she asks about my life with the particular attention of someone who is still learning to be curious about me rather than just concerned about the family system I represent. She still sometimes talks about Caleb in a way that centers his experience and occludes mine, and when that happens, I let it happen without giving it more energy than it deserves. I don't correct her in real time, because the work of correcting her in real time used to be a full-time job, and I have a life now that I would like to live. I just hold my own experience alongside her account, and I know the difference, and that's enough. My father, who has never been the focus of this story but who has been in it peripherally, quietly, is dealing with his health in the methodical way he deals with everything. He and I have a relationship that is warm and slightly formal, the way it has always been. He is not an emotionally expressive man, but he shows up, and showing up is its own language. He came to a book launch event for an author I'd championed last year when the book came out. He stood in the back of the bookstore with a glass of wine and he watched, and at the end he found me in the crowd and said, "You did good work on this book." He'd read it. He read the whole thing to say that to me. I don't know what to do with that exactly except to hold it carefully. Caleb and I talk more than we have since childhood, not without difficulty, not without the occasional moment when old patterns flash up and I have to make a choice, engage or redirect or let it land and handle it later. He's still in therapy. He's better at the things he used to be worst at, following through, acknowledging when he's caused inconvenience, saying sorry for the actual thing rather than for my reaction to the thing. He's not transformed. He's working, which is its own kind of transformation. Last Thanksgiving, the four of us, my parents, Caleb, me, ate dinner at my parents' house. My grandmother was not there. She'd passed in August quietly, which was the way she'd done most things, and her absence sat at the table with us like a fifth place setting. We said grace, which my family has always done, and my father said her name, and my mother cried a little, and Caleb put his hand over hers, and I looked at the table, the 4 plates, the particular imperfect living presence of my family, and felt something that wasn't happiness exactly, not the uncomplicated kind, but something that acknowledged what was real. We are here. We have hurt each other. We are trying. The trying is what we have. I helped clean up after dinner. Caleb dried dishes while I washed, which he has never done voluntarily in his life, and we talked, about nothing, about everything, the way you talk when there's been silence for a long time, and you're relearning how to occupy the same space. He told me about a trip he was planning with his girlfriend, who I have now met twice and who is, I think, genuinely good for him. She asks for what she needs and she doesn't apologize for it, and something in Caleb responds to that. I told him about a manuscript I'd been working on for a year and was finally feeling good about, a novel about a family that keeps secrets the way other families keep recipes. He laughed. He said, "Art imitates life." I said something like that. We put the dishes away. We went back to the living room. My mother had put on a movie, an old one, something from when we were kids, and Caleb and I sat on opposite ends of the couch the way we used to, and my father was in his chair, and my mother was in hers, and the television flickered, and outside the November dark had settled over everything, and we were just a family, flawed and present and working on it, which is, I've come to understand, the only way any family ever is. My name is Shailene Woodley, and I am 34 years old, and I spent most of my life being the easy one, which means I spent most of my life alone with my own experience. I want to tell you what I know now, because this is the part that I think matters beyond my particular family and my particular history, the part that I hope finds the people who need to hear it. Explaining yourself to someone who has already decided how to hear you is not communication. It is performance. It is the action of someone who believes that if they can just find the right words, the right order, the right tone, the other person will finally see them. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes the right words unlock something. But when it isn't true, when the not seeing is structural, when it's built into the system rather than accidentally happening because of a bad day or a misunderstanding, then explaining is just a way of keeping yourself inside a burning building while telling yourself the temperature is manageable. I stopped explaining, and in the quiet that followed, the uncomfortable, frightening quiet that felt at first like failure and loss, I found the version of myself that had always existed but had never been given enough silence to emerge. She was not as accommodating as I'd been. She was not as quick to apologize. She had opinions that she stated clearly and did not immediately soften. She knew what she needed, most days, and she asked for it most days, without performing embarrassment at the asking. She was, it turned out, someone I genuinely liked. The absence that I let my family feel was not a punishment, though I understand it felt like one. It was not cruelty, though I understand it looked like withdrawal. It was the natural consequence of removing my labor from a system that had relied on that labor for decades, and when you remove labor from a system, the system either collapses or it reorganizes, and my family reorganized. Slowly. Imperfectly. With false starts and setbacks and moments where I thought it wasn't working and had to hold the line anyway. My mother learned to see me, not completely, not in the way I imagined being seen when I was 7 years old with a drawing in my coat pocket, but in the real, partial human way that adults see each other when they're paying actual attention rather than moving through the script of their expectations. She sees me more than she did. That's something. My brother is learning to be accountable, not fully, not consistently, but he's learning, which is the most I can ask of any person who is doing the actual work of changing. He's learning that the people who love him are not indefinitely available as audiences for his narrative, that the people who love him have narratives of their own, and that a real relationship is one where both narratives get space. I am learning still every day that my needs are not too much, that my presence is not an inconvenience, that wanting to be seen is not the same as being needy, and that setting a limit is not the same as withdrawing love. I had to unlearn 30 years of the opposite belief, and the unlearning is ongoing, and I expect it will always be ongoing, because the things we learn in childhood about our own worth are very deep and very stubborn, and they don't leave just because we've found the language to name them. But they can lose their grip. And the grip loosens, I've found, not when we explain ourselves more, but when we stop explaining ourselves to people who aren't listening, and start simply being ourselves, the full, undefended, unmanaged version, and seeing who, given that, shows up. My family showed up, not all the way, not without cost, but they showed up. And I finally, after 34 years, showed up too. If you are reading this and you recognize yourself in the person who has spent years managing everyone else's feelings while yours went unmanaged, I want to say this directly to you. The system will call your limits selfishness, and the system is wrong. The system will call your withdrawal cruelty, and the system is wrong. The system will tell you that good people absorb the discomfort of the people around them indefinitely and without complaint, and the system has been telling you this your whole life because the system requires it of you, and the system is wrong. You are allowed to stop explaining. You are allowed to let your absence be felt by the people who didn't value your presence. You are allowed to build a life that is not organized around the management of someone else's experience. You are allowed to need things, not instead of other people, not in competition with other people, but alongside them with equal validity, with equal urgency, with the same expectation of being met. You are allowed to take up space. And if the people in your life can't handle the space you take, if they need you to be small in order for them to feel comfortable, then the problem is not your size. The problem is their comfort. My name is Shailene Woodley, and I am 34 years old, and I finally take up exactly as much space as I actually occupy. It took long enough, but here I am. 4 plates at Thanksgiving, it's a start, it's real, and real I've come to understand is better than perfect every time.